Today's story might be one of the most baffling cases you would ever hear. It may sound like you already know how it will go at the end, but when we actually get to the end, you will realize that you were completely wrong. And before we get into today's story, I just want to mention that I am a 62-year-old man, and obviously my speech is a bit unclear and inconsistent. Pronouncing certain words and keeping pace aren't that simple for me anymore, so if that's not a problem for you, then let's get into today's story. It was around 4 o'clock in the morning on January 11th, 1993, and the streets were pitch black in a little village called Prévessin-Moëns. This is a quiet residential area in eastern France, sitting right on the border with Switzerland. It's the kind of place where people live specifically so they can commute over to Geneva for work. Some municipal road cleaners were out doing their normal rounds through the silent neighborhoods when they noticed that something was very wrong at the Romand family's house. They saw smoke rising up from the roof, and then they spotted a bright orange glow coming from inside the windows. This wasn't just some small flickering light. The entire structure was on fire. They called the fire department immediately. The firefighters from the local station got there within minutes, but they ran into something right away that didn't make any sense. Usually if a house is burning and there are people inside, you're going to see signs of a panic. Things like doors being flung open, windows being smashed, or people trying to find a way out. But this house was completely sealed up. Every single door and window on both the first and second floors was locked from the inside. There wasn't any sign that someone had forced their way in, and even more disturbing was the fact that there was no sign that anyone inside was trying to escape the flames. The crew had to use force to get inside. They broke down the front door and were immediately hit by a wall of thick, toxic smoke that had filled up the entire ground floor. They pushed their way through the heat and the darkness, checking the hallway near the entrance, and that is where they found a man in there. It was Jean-Claude Romand. He was 38 years old and was lying on the floor unconscious. He didn't have any burns on him, and there weren't any marks on his body, but he wasn't responding to anything. It looked like a clear case of smoke inhalation. The firefighters dragged him out of the burning house and got him into an ambulance. Since they were so close to the border, less than 10 kilometers away, they rushed him straight to a hospital in Geneva and put him in the intensive care unit. At that point, the firefighters probably assumed they were dealing with a tragic accident like a fire that caught a family while they were sleeping. But then they went upstairs to the second floor, and the whole story changed. They walked into the master bedroom. The fire hadn't completely destroyed this room yet, so they could see everything pretty clearly. They found Jean-Claude's wife, Florence Romand. She was 37 years old. She was lying in the double bed on her back, tucked under the covers like she was just sleeping. But when they got closer, they saw the condition of her head. She had suffered massive trauma to the back of her skull. It wasn't caused by falling debris or the fire itself. Someone had smashed her head using a heavy, blunt object, and they had done it repeatedly. The strange thing was that there weren't any signs of a struggle at all. The sheets weren't torn up, and the room hadn't been trashed. It looked like she had been killed while she was asleep, without ever even knowing what was happening to her. The firefighters kept moving through the house, checking the rest of the rooms on that second floor. They stepped into the first bedroom for the children, and that is where they found Caroline. She was only 7 years old. She was still in her pajamas and tucked into her bed, but she was dead. Then they moved on to the next room and found 5-year-old Antoine. It was the same situation there. He was in his pajamas, lying in his bed, and he was dead too. What makes this part of the story so chilling is that the children didn't die the same way their mother did. Both of those kids had been shot. Each one had a single bullet wound in their head from a small caliber weapon that had been fired from very close range. And right there next to each of their bodies, the firefighters spotted a pillow lying on the bed. It looked like whoever did this had used the pillows to either muffle the sound of the gunshots or maybe just to cover up what they were doing so they didn't have to see it. By this point, the police, known as the gendarmerie, had shown up and blocked off the whole area. They started taking a look at how the fire actually started, and that theory about it being a tragic accident just fell apart immediately. This wasn't a fire that started in the kitchen or from some electrical issue with a bad wire. The fire had actually been set in several different spots at the same time, up in the attic and in the bedrooms. Plus, you couldn't miss the smell. The entire house absolutely reeked of gasoline. When the investigators went around to the back of the property, they found 2 empty jerry cans just tossed there on the ground. It was pretty obvious at that point what had happened. Someone had gone through the house, pouring gasoline everywhere, and then intentionally lit it on fire. The medical examiners were able to confirm this pretty fast, too, because they looked at Florence and the 2 children and found they didn't have any smoke in their lungs. That meant they were all already dead before the fire even began. So now the police were looking at a triple homicide and an arson case. You had a mother who was beaten to death, 2 kids who were basically executed in their own beds, and then you had the father, Jean-Claude Romand. He was the only person who survived the whole thing. And right then he was unconscious in a hospital over in Switzerland. They started scouring the whole area for any kind of clues, trying to figure out if this was maybe a robbery that went wrong or something else entirely. They took a look at Jean-Claude Romand's car, which was a BMW parked right there in the driveway. It had some damage from the fire, but when they looked inside, they found a note he had written by hand. That note was really strange. It didn't explain why the murders happened, and it didn't even mention his wife or his children. All it said was, and I read in quote, "A trivial accident and an injustice can cause madness." It was all very vague. He asked for forgiveness in the note, but he didn't say what he was asking for forgiveness for. He didn't name anyone either. It just talked about madness and injustice, which didn't give the investigators anything solid to work with, but it definitely suggested that Jean-Claude Romand knew something about what had gone down. While the crime scene technicians were still processing the house in Prévessin-Moëns, the police had a duty to notify the next of kin. They discovered that Jean-Claude's parents, Aimé and Anne-Marie Romand, were living about 80 kilometers south of there. They lived in a tiny village called Clairvaux-les-Lacs, which is deep in the Jura Mountains. The police didn't want to just call the parents up and tell them over the phone that their son was in a coma and their grandchildren had been murdered, so they got in touch with Jean-Claude's uncle instead. They asked him if he could go over to the parents' house and be the one to break the news to them gently. So the uncle got into his car and started driving south. He spent that hour or so on the road thinking he was on his way to deliver terrible news about a fire and a tragedy. He had absolutely no idea what he was actually about to walk into. Later that Monday morning, the uncle arrived at the house in Clairvaux-les-Lacs. Even though it was a Monday, the whole place was completely silent and locked up tight. There weren't any lights on at all. He tried knocking on the door, but nobody came to answer it. So he looked through the windows to see if he could spot any movement inside, but he didn't see anything. The whole situation just felt wrong to him. Because of that bad feeling, the uncle decided he had to force his way into the house. As soon as he broke in, the very first thing he came across was the family dog lying on the floor in the entrance hallway. The dog was dead, and it had been shot. With that strange sight, he kept moving further into the house, calling out for Aimé and Anne-Marie, wondering why they left a dead dog at the entrance. But he didn't get a response. He eventually went into the living room, and that is where he found them. Both Aimé Romand and Anne-Marie Romand were dead. They had both been shot in the back. It looked to the uncle like they had just been going about their normal day. Maybe they were eating something or watching TV, when someone came up behind them and fired at close range. They didn't have any defensive wounds on their hands or their arms, which meant they hadn't fought back at all. It seemed like they probably didn't even know the person was there until the trigger was pulled, or maybe they knew the person so well that they didn't think they were in any danger. The uncle called the police right away. This brought in a second team of investigators from the Jura region, who rushed over to the scene. By the time it got to be midday, the senior investigators were starting to put all the different pieces together. They were looking at 2 separate crime scenes that were 80 kilometers apart from each other. Over in Prévessin-Moëns, a wife and 2 children had been murdered, and their house had been torched. Now here in Clairvaux-les-Lacs, the grandparents and the dog had been executed. When they looked for a connection between the two scenes, they found only one link: Jean-Claude Romand. He was the husband of the dead woman, the father of the dead children, and the son of the couple who had just been found. He was the only person connected to all 5 victims, and he was the only one who was still alive. The police realized then that this wasn't just a random series of attacks, it was a coordinated annihilation of an entire family line. They immediately elevated the status of the investigation. Even though Jean-Claude was still unconscious in a hospital room in Geneva, they put a guard on him. He wasn't just a survivor anymore, he was now the primary person of interest. Back in Prévessin-Moëns, the detectives started talking to the neighbors to find out who this man actually was. They needed to know if he had any enemies, or if this might have been a professional hit or some kind of revenge. The neighbors all told the police the same thing. They described Jean-Claude as a quiet, very respectable man. He was a professional, and they explained that he was a doctor and a medical researcher who had worked for the World Health Organization in Geneva for years. To them, he was a serious man who had a very serious job. The police took note of all that information. It seemed like a solid lead to them. They figured if he was a researcher at the World Health Organization, then maybe this whole thing was about his work. They thought maybe he was involved in some kind of sensitive research, or perhaps it was a case of industrial espionage. Because of that, they decided that verifying his employment was their top priority. They needed to find out if anyone at the World Health Organization had any kind of grudge against the now-established Dr. Romand. So, on the afternoon of the 11th of January, the French detectives picked up the phone and called the World Health Organization headquarters across the border in Switzerland. They were first connected to security, and from there they were sent over to the Human Resources Department. The detectives explained why they were calling. They told HR they were dealing with a medical emergency involving one of their employees, a man named Jean-Claude Romand. They even provided his date of birth to make sure there was no mix-up. The detectives probably expected the person on the other end of the line to be shocked and immediately start looking up his employee file, but that's not what happened. The HR officer checked the database for active employees, but the name didn't show up. There was no Jean-Claude Romand in their system. At first, the detectives were just confused. They didn't think it was necessarily suspicious yet, because large organizations can have really complicated payroll systems. They figured he might be a contractor or perhaps a visiting fellow. They even thought maybe he was technically employed by a different agency that just happened to have offices inside the WHO building. This kind of thing happens all the time in big international organizations. So the detectives didn't give up. They asked for a much more thorough search. They wanted the WHO to check everything: the lists of external consultants, temporary staff, visiting researchers, and even the security clearance logs. They wanted to see if he even had a badge to get into the building. The officials at the WHO went back and per manual review of their records. They were very thorough and checked everything they had going back many years. Eventually, they got back to the detectives with a final, definitive answer. The World Health Organization had absolutely no record of Jean-Claude Romand ever being there. He had never worked for them in any capacity. He hadn't been a consultant, and he had never received a single paycheck from the organization. Even though he had been telling everyone for 18 years that this was his job, his name wasn't on a single list. This discovery completely shifted the energy of the entire investigation in an instant. It's hard to overstate how jarring this was for the police. Everyone in the man's life knew him as the doctor. His wife, his parents, and all of his friends were under the impression that he drove to work every single morning. But the organization itself was saying he didn't exist. Because of this, the police went back to look at the physical evidence again. They had already impounded his BMW, which had been parked in the driveway of the house while it was burning. This car was supposed to be like a mobile office for him. The detectives figured that if he really was a high-level researcher, there would have to be some kind of proof inside the vehicle. They started going through all the items and debris inside the car. They were specifically looking for an employee ID badge or maybe a magnetic key card that would give him access to the labs. They were looking for keys to an office, research papers, confidential files, or even just some old pay stubs. Anything that could prove he actually had a career there. They didn't find a single thing like that. In fact, what they did find was actually more unsettling than finding nothing at all. They discovered a stash of brochures, but these weren't internal work documents. They were just those generic, glossy pamphlets that you can find for free in the visitor's lobby. They had the WHO logos on them, but they just contained general health information that any random person off the street could walk in and pick up. They also found some stationery paper with the WHO branding, but again, it was the kind of thing you could just buy yourself. There were medical journals in the car as well, but they were just standard magazines that you could buy at a regular newsstand or find sitting on a shelf in a university library. There was absolutely nothing classified in the car, and nothing that looked like it belonged to a senior researcher. Then the detectives found some maps. The car was packed with very detailed road maps of the Geneva canton and the various forest areas surrounding it. The maps were clearly well used and worn out. Those worn-out maps suggested that he was just driving around. He was spending his days driving aimlessly, just killing time and waiting for the hours to pass so he could return home and pretend he'd had a long day at the lab. He was just sitting in parking lots or at highway rest stops. He was driving out into the woods. His life wasn't a career at all. It was just one long, elaborate act. The detectives were facing a really massive problem at this point. They couldn't wrap their heads around how a man who hadn't held a job in 18 years was managing to pay for his lifestyle. He owned a house, he drove a BMW, and he was even paying for his children to attend private school. None of it added up. So, that same afternoon, they went ahead and got a warrant to look into his bank accounts, because they desperately needed to figure out where the money was coming from. They went into it expecting to find some kind of illegal income. Maybe he was stealing from somewhere, or perhaps he was involved in something shady and illegal but highly profitable that caused the hit on his family. When they finally got the records and looked at the salary line, the first thing they saw was a big zero. There weren't any transfers from the World Health Organization, and there was absolutely nothing from the United Nations. In fact, there was no regular income showing up at all. But then they checked the actual balances, and the situation was a total disaster. His accounts weren't just empty, they were a complete wreck. He was overdrawn on every single account he had. He had taken out multiple loans, his credit lines were tapped out, and his overdrafts were all maxed to the limit. When they added it all up, his total debt was sitting at about 1.4 million francs. You have to keep in mind that this was back in 1993, so that was a huge amount of money. He was completely underwater. But the part of the investigation that really made the detectives feel sick was when they looked back at the deposit history to see where the money had actually come from over the years. I mean, the family had clearly been eating and living for a long time, so the cash had to come from somewhere. While the investigators were digging through the list of deposits, they came across another name, a woman named Chantal Delalande. She had transferred a single lump sum of 900,000 francs to him. That's a lot of money, so the police flagged her name immediately. Then, the very next day, which was January 12th, the whole story finally hit the news. People all over the country were talking about the tragedy that had happened in Prévessin-Moëns. The TV reports were showing footage of the burning house and talking about this respected doctor who was currently lying in a coma. Over in Paris, Chantal Delalande was watching the news. When she saw his face flash on the screen, she just froze. She knew exactly who he was. As it turned out, she was actually his mistress. She picked up the phone right away and called the police. Chantal told them everything. She was a dentist, she was divorced, and she lived in Paris. She explained that she had been seeing Jean-Claude for a while. He had fed her the exact same lies he told everyone else, that he was this brilliant researcher, that his marriage was miserable, and that he was close friends with various government ministers. She also explained the situation with the money. That 900,000 francs was actually her entire divorce settlement and her savings. She had handed it over to him so he could invest it in that special Swiss fund he talked about, but lately she had actually been asking for the money back. She had been putting pressure on him because she needed it, and of course he didn't have it to give to her. Then she told the police about what happened on Sunday, January 10th. This was the day before the fire. She said that Jean-Claude had invited her to go to a gala dinner with him. He told her the dinner was with Bernard Kouchner, who was the French Minister of Health. He picked her up in Paris, and they started driving. He told her the gala was being held at a place near the forest of Fontainebleau, which is a really big, dense forest located southeast of Paris. This part of the story is honestly terrifying because it gives you a real look into his state of mind at the time. He took Chantal out to a very isolated, quiet area in the woods and parked the car. Once they were stopped, he told her that he had a surprise for her, a gift he'd bought. He said it was a necklace, and he asked her to close her eyes so he could put it around her neck for her. Chantal did exactly what he asked and shut her eyes, fully expecting to feel a necklace. But instead of a gift, Romand suddenly sprayed tear gas right into her face. She started screaming immediately. She couldn't see anything, and she was choking on the fumes. While she was blinded, he pulled out a stun baton, one of those electric shock devices, and started jamming it into her ribs and her stomach. He kept shocking her, trying to completely incapacitate her. Then he grabbed a cord and tried to wrap it around her neck to strangle her. But Chantal didn't give up. She went straight into survival mode and fought back with everything she had. She was hitting him and scratching at him and screaming the whole time. She fought hard enough that she didn't let him get that cord tied around her throat. Then, just as abruptly as the whole thing started, he stopped. He just quit attacking her and pulled away. Then he started crying and completely broke down. And this is where his manipulation is just hard to believe. He told her that his illness was the reason he did it. You have to remember, and I don't know if I already mentioned it, but he had been telling everyone he had cancer, which was just another one of his lies. He claimed that the tumor and the experimental medication he was supposedly taking were making him lose his mind and making him act aggressively. He actually begged her to forgive him for what he'd done. After that, he drove her all the way back to Paris and dropped her off at her home. But he made her promise that she wouldn't tell a soul about his episode. Chantal actually felt sorry for him. She genuinely thought he was just a sick man who was losing his grip on reality because of cancer. So she gave him her word, and she didn't call the police that night. But later, when she saw the news reports about his wife and his children and his parents all being found dead, she realized the truth of what she had actually escaped. The police officially changed his status at that point. Jean-Claude Romand was no longer considered a victim. He was now the prime suspect in 5 different murders and 1 attempted murder. And through all of this, he was still just lying there in that hospital bed in Geneva, waiting to wake up with no idea what the police had found. On January 13, 1993, which was exactly 2 days after the fire, Jean-Claude Romand finally opened his eyes. He was lying in the intensive care unit at the cantonal hospital in Geneva. And if you look at it from a medical perspective, the man really should have been dead. The toxicologists had run tests and found a massive amount of Nembutal in his body. That's a very powerful kind of barbiturate that basically shuts down your entire nervous system. He had swallowed enough of the stuff to kill an elephant, yet somehow he was still alive. The doctors figured out the reason for that very quickly, and it's one of those details that just feels incredibly ironic. It turns out the pills he took were actually really old. They were years past their expiration date, so the chemical potency had degraded over time. Instead of his heart stopping like the drug is supposed to do, the pills just put him into a very deep coma that wasn't lethal. When he finally came to, he didn't even have any permanent physical damage. He was just a bit groggy and found himself in a room full of police officers. The detectives didn't give him any time to get his bearings or try to come up with a cover story. They were sitting right there at his bedside the very second he regained consciousness. Without wasting any second, they just laid everything out for him immediately. They told him that the World Health Organization had already confirmed he never actually worked there. They told him about the bank records they'd found, which showed he was totally broke and had just been living off his parents' money. They even told him that Chantal Delaunay had already given the police a statement about how he had tried to kill her out in the forest. Jean-Claude didn't ask for a lawyer, and he didn't even try to deny what they were saying. He didn't even claim he had amnesia from the fire. He just looked at the detectives and started talking. He confessed to everything right there from his hospital bed. This is the point where the whole thing shifts from being a brutal crime story into something much stranger and darker. He explained to the police that everything, the murders, the arson, and the attack on his mistress, was really just the end result of a lie he'd started telling when he was only 20 years old. He took the detectives all the way back to 1975. At that time, he was a second-year medical student at the University of Lyon. He wasn't a bad student, and he wasn't failing his classes or anything like that, but when the end-of-year exams rolled around, he just didn't go. He hadn't slept in, he wasn't sick, and he wasn't having some kind of crisis. He just simply didn't show up to the exam hall. It's a part of the story that's so hard to wrap your head around because it seems like such a small decision. He just missed the test. Most people in that situation would just tell their parents they failed and then retake the exam in the fall. But instead, Jean-Claude went home to his parents and his girlfriend, Florence, and told them both that he had passed. He told them the whole thing went great. Later on, the official results were posted on the university bulletin board, and obviously his name wasn't on the list. When people started asking him about it, he just told them it was an administrative error. He claimed the university had made a mistake and that they were in the middle of fixing it. Everyone believed him, because really, why would anyone lie about something like that? So, for the next 12 years, and it really went on for 12 years, he just re-enrolled as a second-year student every single September. He would go to the campus, sit in the lecture halls, and take notes. He bought all the textbooks and studied the material just so he could talk like a real doctor, but he never actually took another exam. He just stayed in this weird state of limbo, pretending to advance his career while he was actually just a dropout who happened to know a lot of medical trivia. When his friends finally graduated and started their actual careers, he had to escalate the lie even further. He couldn't really say he was still a student after a whole decade had passed. So he told everyone he'd landed a job at the World Health Organization in Geneva. He said he was a researcher working on heart disease and arteriosclerosis. He made up an entire salary and even made up colleagues. He even went as far as giving his parents a photograph of the WHO building where he'd drawn a little X on a window on the top floor and told them, "That's my office." For 18 years, this man basically lived like a ghost. When he sat down with the detectives, he walked them through what his daily life looked like. And honestly, it sounds like an incredibly exhausting way to live. Every single morning, he would get up early, dress himself in a professional suit, and say goodbye to his wife and their children. He'd walk out the door carrying his briefcase, get into his car, and start driving in the direction of Geneva. But the thing is, he didn't actually have an office to go to, as we already know by now. Most of the time, he would just pull into the parking lot at the WHO and sit there in his car for hours. He spent his time reading through newspapers and medical journals that he'd pick up at newsstands. He did that specifically so he'd have medical topics to discuss during dinner so his family wouldn't suspect anything. On other days, he would spend hours just walking around the wooded areas up in the Jura Mountains. Sometimes he would just sit inside highway rest stops and spend the day staring out the window at nothing. He actually told the police that he probably knew the layout of the Geneva airport better than anyone else on Earth. Whenever he was supposed to be away on a business trip for some big medical conference in Washington, D.C. or Tokyo, he would just drive to the airport and stay there. He'd check into a cheap hotel right by the airport and stay for 3 days. While he was there, he'd study travel guides for whatever city he was supposed to be visiting. He would memorize the names of the streets and check the weather reports for those locations. He'd even go into the airport gift shops and buy little trinkets, stuff that said USA or Japan on it, and bring those home as souvenirs for Florence and the kids. He kept this routine up every single day for 18 years. It is really terrifying to think about how much mental energy it must have taken to maintain that lie for so long. We are talking 18 years. He never once slipped up, and he never accidentally ran into anyone he wasn't supposed to see. He just spent 2 decades existing in this weird, empty void between his home and a career that didn't even exist. Eventually, the detective started asking him about the money, because you obviously can't pay for a mortgage just by telling stories about a fake job. He admitted to them that he was running a Ponzi scheme, but he was only targeting the people he actually loved. He had convinced his family members that because he was such a high-ranking official at the WHO, he had special access to these exclusive Swiss investment accounts that paid out a high yield. He promised them that they would get a guaranteed 18% return on their money. That's a completely unrealistic number, but because they loved and trusted him, they believed it. His parents, Aimée and Anne-Marie, gave him every bit of money they had. They sold off their bonds and moved their entire life savings over to their son because they thought he was so successful. His father-in-law, Pierre Crollet, also gave him hundreds of thousands of francs. Even his mistress, Chantal, handed over the money she had received from her divorce settlement. Instead of investing a single cent of that money, he just dumped all the cash into his own personal checking account. He used that money to fund their entire lifestyle. He bought a BMW, paid for their nice house in Prévessin-Moëns, covered the costs for the kids to go to private school, and took the whole family on expensive vacations. He was basically destroying the future of everyone he cared about just so he could keep up the appearance of having a successful life in the present. During his confession, he also shared a very dark detail regarding his father-in-law, Pierre Crollet. Back in 1988, Pierre had started asking Jean-Claude if he could withdraw some of his capital. He wanted to use the money to fix his roof or buy a new car. So he asked for some of the funds back. Just a few days after that request, Pierre Crollet supposedly fell down the stairs in his garage. It was a very strange accident where he fell from a platform and hit the concrete floor hard. Jean-Claude happened to be the only other person there when it happened. By the time the paramedics got to the house, Pierre was still conscious, but he was fading fast. People who were there as witnesses said he was struggling to say something. He kept mumbling the words, Jean-Claude Ma, which basically means, Jean-Claude did something to me. But before Pierre could finish what he was saying, Jean-Claude stepped in an oxygen mask over his father-in-law's face, claiming he was just trying to help him breathe. Pierre ended up dying a few days later in the hospital without ever saying another word. Jean-Claude didn't technically come out and say he murdered Pierre back in 1988, but he did admit to being there, and he acknowledged that the death conveniently solved a massive financial problem for him. He even went as far as organizing the funeral and then pocketing the money that people had donated for the widow. By the end of 1992, everything was starting to collapse around Jean-Claude. He was getting constant calls from the bank because his accounts were overdrawn, and his mistress, Chantal, was demanding that he give her money back. To make matters worse, a friend of his wife had mentioned that she couldn't actually find Jean-Claude's name anywhere in the World Health Organization directory. He realized right then that it was all over. When he finally spoke to the detectives, he told them he just couldn't deal with the shame of being caught. He said he couldn't stand the thought of seeing the look in his family's eyes once they realized who he actually was. In his mind, the only way to solve the problem was to kill every single one of them. He had decided that death was a better option than the truth coming out. He actually began planning the murders back in January. He visited a gun shop to buy a silencer for a .22 caliber rifle that he had borrowed from his father. To explain why he needed it, he lied to his dad and said he had a pest problem at his house. He also went out and bought gas cans and withdrew the very last bit of cash he had left in his accounts. He walked the detectives through that final weekend, going over it hour by hour. It all started on the night of Saturday, January 9th. He waited until Florence had fallen asleep in their bedroom, and then he stood over her with a heavy wooden rolling pin. He confessed that he didn't want to use the rifle on her because of the noise it would make, though he also suggested it might have been a personal choice. He beat her to death right there in her bed, hitting her repeatedly until she was dead. After that, he cleaned her up a little bit, pulled the duvet back over her body, and just stayed in the house with her all night long. The next morning was Sunday. This was probably the most disturbing part of his entire confession. His children, Caroline and Antoine, woke up just like it was any other normal day. Jean-Claude actually made breakfast for them. He sat down on the couch with them, and they watched cartoons together. He told the police that he was cuddling them and telling them how much he loved them, all while knowing it was the very last time he would ever do that. Once the cartoons were over, he told the kids to go upstairs and take a nap. He followed them up there and went into Caroline's room first. He placed a pillow over her head so it would muffle the sound and shot her once. Then he walked into Antoine's room and did the exact same thing to him. After he killed them, he tucked them both into their beds as if they were just sleeping. Once his entire immediate family was dead, he got into his car and drove over to his parents' house in Clairvaux-le-Lac. He arrived around lunchtime and sat down at the table with his mother and father. He actually ate a full Sunday meal with them, talking and letting them serve him food like everything was fine. After they finished lunch, while his parents were perhaps clearing the table or just relaxing in the living room, he went out to his car to get the rifle. He walked back inside and shot his father in the back. Then he shot his mother in the back as well. Neither of them ever saw what was coming. The family dog started barking at the noise of the shots, so he ended up shooting the dog too. After that, he closed all the curtains, locked the door, and drove away from the house. That evening, he drove all the way to Paris to pick up Chantal. This was the point where his plan finally started to fail. As I already narrated, he drove her out to the forest, pulled the car over, and tried to kill her. He sprayed her with tear gas and tried to strangle her, but she fought back against him with everything she had. She was screaming and scratching at him, and for some reason, maybe he was just exhausted or he finally lost his nerve, he just stopped. He ended up driving her back home and made up a lie, telling her that his cancer medication was making him act crazy. He actually managed to talk her out of calling the police right then and there. He then drove back to his own house in Prévessin-Moëns. By this time, it was late, in the early hours of January 11th. He went back inside the house where his wife and children had been lying dead for nearly 24 hours. He started pouring gasoline everywhere, in the attic, down the hallway, and in the bedrooms. He eventually went into the bedroom where Florence was. He took a bunch of expired sleeping pills and then lit the fire. He lay down right next to his wife's body and waited for the end. But the chemistry didn't work out the way he planned. The pills didn't kill him, they just knocked him out. Before the smoke could finish the job, the firemen found him and pulled him out of the burning house. So, the whole thing ended with him sitting in a hospital bed, explaining to detectives that he had wiped out 3 entire generations of his family because he was too afraid to tell them he had dropped out of college 18 years ago. He murdered everyone he loved just to protect his own ego. All right, that's all for today. I believe you enjoyed the story. Of course, if you didn't, then why on earth are you still here? Anyways, thanks for showing up, and see you in the next story.